You did one push-up. You read one paragraph. You stuck with it for a month. And the strange part is, nothing grew. The push-up never became 10. The paragraph never became a chapter. It's a piece of advice you've probably heard, the 2-minute rule. The logic makes perfect sense. The hardest part of any new habit is starting, so you shrink the commitment until the friction of initiation completely disappears. But if you take that advice exactly at face value, you usually end up with exactly what millions of other people get, a tiny daily ritual that never scales up, leaving you with a quiet feeling that you must lack discipline. The truth is, you aren't lazy. The 2-minute rule is simply an incomplete equation. Optimizing only for the starting line creates the costume of a behavior, habit cosplay, rather than an actual habit in formation. To see where the equation breaks down, we have to look at University College London in 2009. Researchers here ran an experiment that reshaped how psychologists view behavior change. A team led by Phillippa Lally tracked exactly how long it took volunteers to make a new daily behavior feel automatic. You might have seen the famous average that came out of this paper, 66 days. But the average hides the most important part of the data, the actual spread. This chart shows the formation timelines. Some locked in a habit in 18 days, but the right side stretches to 254 days, almost 9 months of doing something every day. The crucial detail? Behaviors at the extreme slow end stayed small and unchanging. The action was easy enough, but it wasn't building anything. Lally's data reveals a harsh truth. Repetition alone, without a meaningful escalation in effort, does not automate a behavior. We can find out why by rewinding to 1932. A behavioral scientist named Clark Hull was watching rats run mazes, and he noticed that the animals accelerated as they got closer to the food at the end. Their speed was tied to their proximity. He termed this the goal gradient effect. It's a biological feature of how brains motivate effort. The closer you perceive yourself to be to a finish line, the harder you push. To test if humans operate the same way, researchers in 2006 handed out 2 types of coffee loyalty cards. One group received a blank 10-stamp card, and the second received a 12-stamp card with 2 pre-filled. Both required 10 coffees, yet the group with the artificial head start completed their cards faster. That perception of closing distance drove motivation. This is exactly where the standard 2-minute rule stalls out. When you freeze an action at 2 minutes indefinitely, you eliminate the finish line. There is no closing distance, which means the brain's goal gradient motivation slowly evaporates. Later research out of Harvard confirms the necessity of this forward momentum. Teresa Bailey analyzed thousands of work diaries to figure out what sustains human drive during long-term commitments. She expected to find that financial reward or peer recognition topped the list. Instead, the single most powerful daily motivator turned out to be visible progress, even if it was microscopic, a line moving on a chart or a page count climbing. She called this the progress principle. It dictates that the brain must actually see movement to validate the energy it's spending. So 2 minutes of effort that never goes anywhere is still just 2 minutes. The brain interprets the behavior as simply treading water, rendering your daily reps invisible to the parts of your mind that decide what gets reinforced. There is a final missing piece, and it comes from Stanford researcher B.J. Fogg, the original pioneer of the Tiny Habits framework. In his version of the formula, getting a behavior to stick requires one mandatory final step, a genuine emotional celebration immediately following the tiny action. A fist pump, a genuine smile, a quiet yes to yourself. The mechanics here are strictly neurological. Your brain remembers and wires in behaviors that feel rewarding. When popular advice says, make it small, but skips the emotional marker at the end, it strips out the actual wiring mechanism. You're left with a behavior that is technically easy to do, but neurologically unanchored. To fix a stalled routine, we have to recognize a brutal truth about self-improvement. Easiness is not the same as effectiveness. The fix requires putting the missing variables back into the formula. First, you keep the tiny start. The 2-minute rule is genuinely useful for bypassing initial friction, but you have to treat it as a doorway rather than a destination. Second, you establish an escalation rule. This flowchart illustrates how it works. You decide in advance exactly what triggers the next size of the habit. For example, once one push-up feels effortless for 7 days, you step up to 3. This introduces a finish line and wakes up the brain's goal gradient motivation. Third, you track your growth using a visible chain rather than a streak. Streaks track how many consecutive days you perform an action, meaning if you miss a day, the entire structure collapses. A visible chain tracks the increasing size of the behavior over time. If you miss a day, the line is still there and the progress principle remains intact. Finally, you add a genuine emotional spark at the exact moment you finish the session to hit the reward circuitry and signal to your brain that the action is worth keeping. Pair a tiny start with a defined horizon, visible growth, and an emotional payload. You give your brain exactly what it needs to transform a cute miniature ritual into a permanent, heavy-duty behavior. Pick one habit you've been stuck on, the one you've been doing in miniature for months, and decide right now what your escalation rule is going to be this week. Drop a comment below with the habit you're working on and what size it has stayed stuck at. I read those patterns to shape future videos. And if you want more advice grounded in actual research rather than hustle slogans, hit subscribe. Try the experiment and let yourself find out what changes.